Good afternoon, this is Lee McWhorter. This is the second video lecture workshop for the Security Foundations course that began last week. Last week we had covered the first 5 lessons, and we, as a quick review, had gone over sort of some basics of Intro to Security Foundations, probably one of the most important concepts there, the CIA triad. And then we had talked about various security roles, pretty straightforward chapter, attacks and threat actors, talking about the different types of hackers and wannabes out there. And then we talked a little bit about information security, the layered model of protection, as well as the 7 domains. And then we got into defense basics. And there we talked about the castle, the defense in depth, layered security, and all that good stuff. And so that's where we pick up, is with the last 5 lessons. Lesson 6 is further defense concepts. And basically, we have 4 main areas to cover there. And just like with, as we said, a lot of this stuff in this first lesson, these first lessons, this first class that come back again and again, you'll be keeping these concepts and principles in mind as you do your job for hopefully years to come in designing defense of systems and networks and building security policy. And so they're important concepts. No doubt, in and of itself, the one from lesson 5, defense in depth or layered security, is much more important than any of the others that we're going to talk about here in 6, but they all factor in, and they have different degrees of value to add to the organizational plans and to your strategic and tactical plans when you're designing a defense strategy. So the 4 are, and I'm going to cover them a little differently than they're covered in the lessons, but they're diversity, limiting, obscurity, and simplicity. And I'm actually going to save obscurity for the end. So real quickly, what are these concepts and how do they play into our thinking when we're trying to design defense strategy? Well, diversity actually works really very closely with what we talked about in lesson 5, defense in depth. We have the issue of, I think we understand that now, right? We want to have multiple layers of security, just like that castle with its moat and its walls and various defenses. We want to have firewalls and various other equipment, maybe intrusion detection. And you're going to learn all about this stuff as you go through the program. We're going to want to have different, types of policies in place. So we have, a layer of defenses there, multiple layers. But if we use the example of either hardware or policies, for that matter, if we only have, say, hardware from one particular vendor, or we only use, a certain set of policies, we've sort of, and we'll talk about these more actually here in a bit, so this will make a little more sense. So hang on to this phrase of security frameworks. But if we're only using sort of the templates from one, set of security policies, and we don't have any kind of internal procedural checks and balances, then what we end up with is that if there's basically a single point of failure there in our system, right? So if we have all this great equipment, firewalls and intrusion detection and scanners and monitoring tools and all this stuff, but it all comes from vendor XYZ, and then there is someday found out that there is a 0-day, a super exploit, hacker uncovers a vulnerability in that underlying vendor's operating system. And then all of a sudden that attacker is through all of your layers of defenses with the same key, right? Because all of those products are probably using that same underlying operating system, and which is common for the vendors of products like that. And so then you end up having a very high potential that an attacker could get through. So what we're talking about with diversity, and it goes very well in with the security layers, is that we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket, right, in any way, shape, or form. And so not only do we want to have all these layers, but we want to have diversity, difference in those layers. So while we like everything, there's that trade-off of security versus convenience, right? I think I made the reference last week that, IT people from a security point of view might want 250 character length passwords and have them change all the time. But that very secure solution would, of course, be very inconvenient, and we end up finding somewhere in the middle between no passwords and super passwords that we're trying to aim for based on the needs of the security needs of the organization. So we have to do the same thing here. We don't want to make every piece of equipment different. That would definitely increase security by diversity, But once again, that trade-off. So now we have the inconvenience of we are, having to deal with and maintain and patch and support all these different pieces of equipment and all these different configurations. So we're not wanting to go to the extreme on this, but once again, somewhere a happy middle. Maybe most of our equipment is from Cisco or Juniper or whoever, but maybe we throw some other things into the mix that are from other vendors. We might even use some open source solutions like you're going to learn about in this program, and that's not uncommon actually. That while there might be a backbone of routers and firewalls and things from one of the major vendors on your enterprise network, that you still might throw up some other devices and nodes that are based on other solutions from other vendors, or maybe based on just rolling your own, so to speak. And so this way, even if the attacker goes boom, 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 and they hit all your Cisco products or your Juniper products or your HP enterprise products, whatever it is, and they're starting to break in, they're still going to have some other steps in that layer of defense that are different. They're going to run into oh, this company built a snort firewall and put it on some old hardware, and they've got it over here monitoring, and I don't have, they've locked it down pretty tight. It's not even on the internet per se. It's just passively monitoring. How am I going to stop this? So we have at least some way to some alerts to still go off and catch this intruder, right? So that's the diversity idea, and that applies both to hardware, which is an easy thing to kind of grasp, but also to policy too. You might want to have different procedural checks and balances as well, and take ideas from different security guidelines as you build your policy, so that we end up having, once again, more than one way of going about doing that protection. So our layers are diverse as well as being deep. Okay, so then limiting is just a base concept. It's actually a really important one because it applies to so much. The idea in limiting is, as its name implies, you limit access to stuff. And as a baseline security rule, it's actually a pretty important one because it applies to so much. For example, when we talk about firewalls, which you'll learn some about in the next class, Network Foundations, one of the things we'll talk about is how most of the time, and you can think of your home router, it's doing this now. It's using a limiting policy of explicit deny. We're not letting anything in to the system, right? That's just out of the box. Every home firewall will do that. It does not let anything in from the outside into your network unless you have opened the various holes, either through configuring the router or using something like universal plug and play, kind of UPnP kind of functionality where it generates, opens ports dynamically on the router to let something out, like a cam maybe that has an external monitoring function. And so, but in general, we're limiting. So the firewall by default is limiting all access in, and only let stuff come in if it's been requested. So you can surf inside and go to get your page, and when the request comes back, the firewall is aware of that, that came from the inside, and it's a response, not an additional request. And so it lets it back through. Or if you configure some kind of gap like that, and we can think of it too when we give employees access to files and network shares and resources. We want to limit them to the minimum amount that they need to do their job, though. Once again, we're not in a bubble. Our job in security is to empower the organization, so we don't want to so lock that down. But that's the idea, that we're using that as our baseline assumption, that we're going to give as little permissions, just as much necessary. And if we keep that philosophy in mind while we're assigning permissions and we're designing policy and we're building networks and we're doing things, and we apply that everywhere, to firewall rules, we're only going to let in very specifically what we want and limited otherwise. We're going to let people have access to the files they need, of course, to do their job, but only the files they need. We're not just going to go, well, the cell's public share, why don't we let everybody have access? No, if they're different and there's no need for them, for another team to see that share, then don't share it to them. Don't give other people that access, because crypto virus, for example, can't get to those shares if the user doesn't have access. So by limiting, we can minimize that potential damage. Or just if attacker takes that machine and gets some kind of Trojan on it or something, and they're going to use it to pivot within your network because they've been able to trick this person into opening something as a spearfish or whatever the case may be. So that's what we're trying to do. We don't want, everybody to have everything. It's the exact opposite. Generally, it's a very baseline. We don't want to. Now, another important concept, though, that sort of balances all this, and I've already done it myself. I've used multiple examples of we don't want to go to the extremes, of security at the expense of, doing what we need to do to get the job done, for the organization, and letting people within the organization do their jobs. So there has to be a balance. And so simplicity here is an important concept. The reality comes down to is if you get too complex, so let's say you go crazy with diversity, right? Like I used that example a minute ago. Okay, we learned about diversity. We know we got to have a layered defenses. So we're going to be super secure. We're going to have not so layered defenses, and every piece of equipment is going to be from a separate vendor or some combo of open source, and we roll ourselves. And everything's diverse. So there's no way that one hacker, can get, with one exploit can wipe, get all the way through all of our systems, because they're all different, all running on different OSs, all different vendors, all different open source solutions, all layered in there. That's really secure. But then the maintenance for both the system admin team to keep that all patched and monitored, and then of course us, from the point of view of integrating all this from multiple, we probably got a lot of work, maybe some manual work to analyze some of these stuff, because since they're not, there's some advantages to having things from similar vendors. Maybe it's not all talking in the same formats, or because we've gone such a, and of course it's just complex. And so if it's complex, then the more complex something is, the more likely something will go wrong, is what it comes down to, or people will cheat. That example I used earlier, and I've used a few times, of a 256 character password, if that's the case, if we impose something along those lines, then people are not going to be able to remember that, right? Obviously. So they're going to be Post-it notes all over your organization or inside the first drawer that have that written down. And every day when they come in and they generate a new password because the secure policy requires them to, or it generates it for them, however you want to do that, they're going to have to write that down so that they can get in and out of their system all day. And of course, if most people are doing that, then of course a hacker just needs to get in and spend a little bit of time in your organization. And then of course, while the passwords change for the brief period of time, they know how to get them. They just have to visit, send somebody in on a recon mission, send somebody in pretending to be an interested customer, and get a tour of the facility, and they've got themselves a handful of passwords, right? So simplicity, and the more complex you make a system, like with the diverse idea of just every piece of equipment different, then, it's a possibility that we're going to make a mistake. We're going to forget to patch one of those. We're not going to have it standardized because everything's different. And so we have to balance that out. So then that leads us to our last one, which is actually, in my opinion, kind of the fun one. In many cases, the insecurity, there's not a lot of controversy. I mean, in the sense of lots of fields have debates, really sometimes very passionate debates on one side of the issue or another, in sciences and in different fields. But, there's, I guess, a passionate black hat and white hat. Each side's passionate about what they're doing, trying to get in and learn. And it's a controversy, obviously, when somebody does get exploited. But when it comes to the topics that we teach and that are really part of our profession, there's not a lot of controversy. We know they attack, we try to defend. There's these good, solid principles, but there are occasionally, and there are a couple actually, that are kind of interesting debates. And this is one of them. And we'll talk about another one later in the course when we get into talking about a little bit about red team, blue team, and penetration testing and stuff later. So, but this one is the concept of security by obscurity. And this is a hugely controversial thing in our field. You just need to be aware of that. You will find people out there, professionals and people who've written blogs and articles about it, who are very adamant that this is a complete waste of time, and that there is no value to be gained by this concept, which the concept of security by obscurity basically says that if you keep things secret, obscure, then you can maintain a stable, secure system. Whether that's an application, a network, whatever. If you keep some of those things secret, if you can, if a team goes off and builds a new app, just those, half a dozen people, Sally, Bill, Jim, whatever names I want to make up, right? That team knows all the internal workings. They know the secrets and they keep it secret. then that's going to be one heck of a secure app is the concept. But like I said, there's a lot of people who are like, no way, that doesn't do any good at all, because people will reverse engineer. Somebody's going to tell the secret. The industry is very kind of incestuous. People are always bouncing from one company to another in the tech fields and high tech companies. So, and even in other industries for that matter. And so, or somebody slips up, they mention something, hacker gets in, finds the password written down in the notes. There's just hard to keep secrets. So, there's a whole bunch of people who think that's totally, just hogwash. Doesn't do any good. There's no use to it. You can try, but ultimately it's of no use. And then there's some people who are very, feel pretty strongly that there are lots of uses and that you should definitely, factor this in even for a limited value in almost every situation. I tend to fall into the middle. I believe that there is some use for security by obscurity, but you kind of have to think it through where it makes sense. So let me give you my favorite example. I mean, one way to obscure something, say on the internet, is if you're running some kind of service like mail or web or FTP or any kind of other application, that instead of leaving it on its default ports, you change that. And so if you do that, that's obscuring where it lives. And so, if we move our web server from the standard port 80 to something else, maybe something weird that no one uses, 10,013, some other number, then technically we've obscured and hidden our website. Now, of course, if we do this for a publicly facing website, like our main client website, then it's going to mean that our customers are going to have to add to the end of the URL in their browser a colon and 10,013. And we are not going to want our customers, and our customers aren't going to want to do that. They're not going to understand. We're going to have to run special ads on television to explain to them to come to our special URL. And then we're telling everybody, so it's not obscure anymore, right? So that's technically neither obscure nor is it convenient. It's causing our customers to do more than we want them to do. So obviously that wouldn't really help. But let's say you are running, over here, still in your DMZ, and you're out there on the net because it's a test box that you want to test right before you go to production. So you need it to be in a similar environment, and so you've got it out there so you can hit it externally, and check it and test it. And this development server is only used by half a dozen people in your organization. Now here's a case where, in my opinion, you can use obscurity to gain some value. So how would that be? Well, you move that web server up to some weird port. So that web server is not operating there anymore. It's now operating it, instead of port 80, it's operating on port 10,080 or 20,000 and something, whatever numbers you want. Now, your developers internally, your testing people, quality control people, they're going to have to put in the URL and tag on that colon whatever port number we used, but that's only half a dozen people, and we don't care. What we're looking for is that, we talked last week about all the different types of hackers, and at the lower end is the sort of what we're referred to as the script kiddies, right? The folks that have, got a new computer at Christmas or their birthday, or they finally have gotten into this area. Some friends showed them a neat little trick that they learned, and they go off and they start downloading all the tools, get themselves a copy of Kali Linux and set themselves up, and they start running some of these scripts and tools and start doing some of these automated basic kinds of attacks and scans. They're going to do that, and those tools by default are going to use the standard ports. And so if you've moved that web server off port 80 to some strange port address, that doesn't mean the hacker can't find it. And a really sophisticated hacker who's targeting you specifically is definitely going to find that, because they're going to sweep the whole network and look for all open ports and any tricks you may have your sleeve. Well, I'm not worried about him. The script kiddie, though, is just launching the script. And by default, it's going to attack 80 and 443, the default web ports for regular web and SSL, HTTPS web. And it's going to be scanning to look for web servers in some common misconfiguration, and it's going to hit your main server because you've got it out there on port 80 or operating, to work with the other people. But it's going to skip your dev server and never even touch it, because it's going to try port 80 and no response, and off it rolls on in its scripty little way to do the next one on the IP list, right? So in my opinion, while it's not something you can use in all cases, it is something that you can use in many ways to help things out. Even in some of your development activities, if you're building web applications or applications, there's common things. And I guess this comes back to one of those best practices of technically never use defaults. But, that's, like default passwords, definitely don't ever use those. You got to change those. But a lot of times, if you can, this is where it comes into a little debate, but if you can, obviously you can't change your main mail server to using weird ports, or no one in the world is going to be able to send you email, because everybody uses port 25 and mail servers talk to each other on standard protocols, and we can work around that, sure, but that's just more trouble than it's worth. And so we're not going to change our public web server to some weird port and make our clients come in with a colon port number on the end of the URL. They're just going to hit xyz.com. But other things, we can use some of this obscurity, like I mentioned with the dev server or other types of systems, where you just don't leave them where they're expected. You put them someplace else, so that if nothing else, some of these automatic attack tools will not work. A common thing, and something we'll look at later in the program, is how to exploit applications, web applications, and do different things, inject stuff into that. And so that can vary from SQL injection, being able to read or write into a database behind that application, to being able to actually inject commands that maybe run on the system, or being able to inject additional files or upload files through vulnerabilities. And so one of the things is that we'll see, and it's not something that's quite pointed out, I'll point it out in a lecture when we get to that class later, but from you folks, but the, by many times when you go to a site and it lets you upload something, if an attacker is trying to see if they can use that and exploit that, they can look at the source code, they can figure certain things out, they can probably figure out where the file is going to end up on the hard drive of the underlying system, especially if they're assuming certain defaults again, that, okay, it's an Apache web server, and so usually those files are stored in this path on the Linux server, and I know this because I've scanned it. And so then if I can get my file in there and then figure out a way to execute it, I can run my exploit, right? So once again, a trick is to obscure. It's one of the things I do actually commonly if I run an upload site of any kind on a website or FTP for a client, is as soon as a file is uploaded, I move it in the file system and I change its ownerships and rights and permissions, so that even if some hacker had managed to somehow exploit and manipulate, use one of these tools to, instead of just allowing a graphic to be uploaded to, they try to upload an executable. And I actually see this on my Linux servers occasionally, depending on which site we're talking about and when vulnerabilities come and go as we patch them and things like that. But occasionally I've seen like an exe that's been uploaded to my Linux server, and that was some hacker or some tool that was trying to see if they could get that in, and they were hoping it was a Windows server, then they could execute it and run it. But of course I have moved it to a different place, so while it looked like it was going to go here, if they're reviewing my code, my backend code actually runs a script that moves those files instantly and changes their permissions so that they can't be. And so that's obscurity, but because it's hidden, it's actually very useful, and it tends to add value. So enough on security by obscurity. You actually have an exercise to take a look at that and read this really interesting article with a lot of different viewpoints and make your own decision about it. But I think it has some value if thought about right in the right context. So that's full disclosure from your instructor. Now, the next two lessons are kind of tied together, and we're going to hit them together, and that is something I've mentioned now, security guidelines or frameworks, and that's what lessons 7 and 8 are all about. And the idea is sort of, you can sort of preface the sections by saying, okay, so we get this, we're starting to get it, and we got some information, we understand, we got to protect it, we got all these different strategies and principles we can use, and all these things we're trying to protect it against. But how do we then really create from an organizational security policy that handles all this for us and covers all these bases? Do we just have to start from scratch and think of everything? No, thankfully we don't, because even though this is an exploding field and there's a lot of people new to it and coming into it like you folks, the reality is it's also been going on for a while. So there are lots of organizations, generally governmental regulatory bodies or standards bodies that set standards, or they sometimes can be industry bodies, as we'll see as well. But there's various groups out there in governments that have put together different guidelines, security frameworks, as we call them, and they are basically a collection of documents, usually that outline, a recommended best practices to meet certain, types of security needs. So the one we start with that's easiest for most people to grasp is because almost all of us, have had some interaction, if not carrying a few around in our pocket, are credit cards, debit cards, and all that. Well, the payment card industry, PCI, is the industry body that is basically made up of Visa, MasterCard, and all the credit, the banks and the card holder, the card providers and the card, issuers and the processors. And they have all formed this industry. And they put out DSS, their digital security standards, that basically are guidelines for people who take credit cards on how they must maintain a minimum, a very bare minimum set of security. And it has 12 realms, and it varies from that you need to, test your own networks, including up to penetration testing of your systems. That everybody that has access to this confidential data, the credit card information, credit card holder information, that everybody with access to that systems, to those networks and those computers has to have a unique account so that you can audit who's getting into it and see what's going on, right? And so there's this, and you have to have some internal security training. And so you may read this and kind of be surprised that every little mom and pop company in the world, technically, that is taking and receiving credit cards is supposed to follow this framework and is supposed to be able to document that they can do these things and that they've done these things and that they have separate logins and they follow security practices and this and that. And if they don't, and then there's a breach, of course, they could lose their right to issue credit cards, which of course could kill a lot of sort of e-commerce or online businesses. So it's one that most people can grasp because it's pretty basic. And actually, if you think of it, and I know this is new to you, but that's why I present it first. We present it first. It's at a very bare minimum, the PCI DSS standards and their 12 realms are kind of the barest bone outline for any organization's security. They provide just sort of the skeleton, and you got to do at least this to be PCI DSS compliant. But I'm going to argue, and as we talk into the next lesson, that companies should have much more. Even the smallest companies should have at least some additional things that they've developed to flush out beyond just the minimum outlined in PCI DSS. And so, when you get into the next lesson, you're going to see all kinds of acronyms, as our industry is so loving to have, but NIST and just the world is, I guess, too. So we've got ISO, International Standard Organization, NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology from the United States. There's the European equivalent. There's some other industry bodies that you're going to look at. And they all provide different sets of guidelines and frameworks. And so what we really recommend that a practitioner in our field do, or that companies do, is that they look out there. And if you're in that rare case where you're having to really like a startup or a company growing that finally realizes we've gotten pretty big, we better flesh this out and start realizing and have a good security policy. And so in the rare case where you have to almost start from scratch, you don't. You look at, if you work for XYZ company, you look at, okay, what kind of industries are we in? Do we take credit card? Okay, well, we better do at least the minimum PCI DSS. So we're going to pull down all their docs. Okay, what else do we do? Okay, we operate in Europe and America. So we better look at the NIST and maybe the ISO and definitely the European standards, especially their new general data protection standards they just put out here a week or so ago now, and take those into account. We need to take into account maybe some state laws and guidelines and other, and we bring in these, we basically just start downloading all these documents and PDFs and spreadsheets and templates and things that each of these the organizations provide, and kind of sort through them all. And what generally happens is you'll end up picking and choosing a little bit. Maybe you would like, well, you got to make sure you hit certain things. And if you're required, like if you take credit cards, you got to follow the minimum from PCI DSS. If you're in certain sectors like healthcare, schooling, education, we have some requirements. for privacy of your student data. Obviously, banking, certain industries, defense, military contractor or something like that, then you're going to have to look at those specific, the banking regulations, the DoD regulations, and you're going to have even more things you must follow. You're going to have to encrypt everything or whatever, but you've got to look at what you're required to do. But don't just stop there. Look at some of these other bodies and look at some of their things, because you're going to make sure as you build your own policy that you check all those boxes in the required category. But that may say something like, you have to have some kind of security awareness training, for example. That's what PCI DSS says, bare minimum, and all of them would recommend that as a baseline thing you should have, some training in your company. So, okay, in the various bare minimum, mom and pop company, they may just have a newsletter they send out once a year, or they talk 5 minutes about security at their annual meeting with their 12 employees, and that checks that box. But you're a bigger organization and you've got people in different locations. So maybe you look at one of these other frameworks and they've got a training outline plan that they recommend that you rotate quarterly training program, and you decide, okay, to check this required box that we have security awareness training, we're going to use this outline from this guideline. Or when we're doing our risk assessments, we really like how these people gave us these spreadsheets that we could use to help calculate those, and now we'll use those as a template. So you end up bringing information, and it's sort of like, I always use the example of one of two things. If you were going to, like maybe you'll be doing here in the coming months, you'll be updating your resume, or if you've never produced one, you might, well, obviously career services would help you. It was you some, I'm sure, they have resources like that, and they point you at some. But if you're just on your own, you might Google how to write a resume, right? Resume templates or something. And so you go out and you read somebody's article and they show you a sample resume. You go out to a site and they've got 5 or 6 resumes, templates. Some of the job sites provide templates that they sort of give you an idea of. If you're applying for this type of job, you might want to emphasize these things, in this type of job, these type of things. And there's sort of professional resumes, graphics, art, a technical coder, different kinds of resumes. Even in education, sometimes they refer to resumes as vitas, which basically are their curriculum vita. What have they done? It's their resume, but it also usually includes things like any publications or other things they've done as part of being an academic. That's their resume, and so they follow the Vita template. And so if you're going to write your own resume, you got to go out there and look at some templates. You're probably just not going to start writing down. I mean, most people could do that. Maybe not the hardest example, but the same thing. If you're going to build something, you probably go look for some blueprints, right? And you get an idea of something as a guideline. And that's what these frameworks do. These standards bodies have provided, it might be in the case of a handful of PDFs you can download from PCI DSS, and you've got pretty much everything you need to bare minimum meet those requirements and follow that framework and guidelines. But of course, if you're anything bigger than just a 2-man pizza shop or little e-commerce web, you probably need to think a little beyond just PCI DSS. So take a look at some of these others. You'll have to do a little more research into them, and you're definitely going to want to know these major ones listed in this chapter, because they're all obviously like Security Plus exam questions. They might ask you what NIST is, or what a standard body is, etc. So then the next thing we talk about is we shift back to fill in a little bit of, and I mentioned this I think last week, but when we talked about threat actors, we talked about them from the human point of view primarily. We talked about script kiddies and hacktivists and criminal hackers being a main driving force, and then as you continue to step up the chain, you get into these highly organized, organized and professional hackers, and then nation state players, that are part of NSA, CIA, Mossad, different MI6, MI5 over in England, wherever, and they're government sponsored. And of course, I listed a lot of them, allies from at least America's point of view, obviously, and then of course there's people that are in just almost every country, it seems, is getting into this some way, shape, or form now. And what are they doing? Are they trying to steal state secrets? Or are they trying to espionage? Or are they trying to do like corporate espionage, where they're trying to steal manufacturing tricks and techniques that they can then replicate in their country? Whatever the reason or target, these are the players out there. So we talk in this chapter, our lesson in 9, a little bit more about the attributes, and it kind of makes sense. It kind of goes with this rankings. Is you start with the more inexperienced and script kiddies at the lowest level, just starting out using the basic tools. They generally speaking have very little resources, very little experience. That scales, of course, as they move up the chain and become more experienced and graduate at some point to being some form of a true hacker, right? Beyond just running script tools, they can actually do a little more. They've learned, they've had some experience. And then, but even then, their resources, if they're individuals, may still be their skills may climb, but their resources are usually pretty low, and their motivations can vary from, for different reasons. Some script kiddies are just still old school, doing it to learn. Or to see what you can do. And of course, some of them are doing it to take down their friend's Minecraft server, so it might be a revenge. And then of course, some start to realize, oh, I can defraud and make a little money, right? So that's a big motivator as we move into the criminal aspect. Is all about the money. Whether that's sending out spam to sell fake goods, or trying to steal credentials, or break into stuff to sell the data. There's money making opportunities. Of course, there are on the white hat side, thankfully, just as well. And that can motivate a hacker to even be, a money-making white hat hacker. There's a whole group of people we call security researchers that basically make their money by, being in the industry. They do some consulting, they help with clients, whatever. But one of their big things maybe is to find these bugs and then report them to many of the companies, the big tech companies. Many of them will pay you. They have what they call a bug bounty program. So once again, we have a motivation of money. But as we move up the line, of course, we start to find these groups, these criminal groups, particularly initially, that they are starting to bring together. A couple of them are coming together. They've been successful. Maybe it's some organized crime gang that already exists somewhere in the world who's brought in the hackers and are funding them, or the hackers will sort of come together, met each other online, realize they're running a similar scam and they can benefit from each other. Hey, I've got a good botnet, you've got the good scam. That's something, exploit software or whatever. Let's put this together, and so they grow, and now they've got more resources, either because they're starting to make some money or they're being funded in some way, shape, or form. And of course, since they've survived, haven't gotten caught, haven't gotten bored, as some kids do, and never make it past script kiddie, go back to playing games instead of trying to learn how to program and really get deeper into this. But obviously, some do. And then they take the next level. And so, the idea of understanding the attributes is to understand what kind of targets you're facing. The script kiddies are pretty automated. You can avoid a lot of that with just the basic common principles we pound on in this program. And then the middle tier, of course, sometimes, especially if the more targeted something comes at your organization, the harder you're going to have to work to deal with it, to find it, to stop it, to keep it out. And so I'm not saying you can't, but you definitely can, and you can at least minimize the impacts by doing the right things and following some of these principles we talked about. And then, of course, if they get up to the highest ends, then you have teams that are funded by state resources. They may have access to obviously great systems, or as good as can be acquired for the country they're in, the region they're in, technology they have. Good connections, maybe ways to fake that, and of course, beyond the standard techniques, maybe some control through the state's communications companies, things to hide things. All kinds of possibilities come into play, and so these become the much more. And as a matter of fact, we have a phrase and something you might see on the exam as well as APT, which is advanced persistent threat. That's when we finally have graduated up. And I honestly believe myself that some of the highest end criminal organizations can achieve a degree of advanced persistent threat, though that's not usually their model. They have the sophistication to, but definitely some of these nation state players do, and that's their goal. We're finding this out from some of these breaches we've heard about, and that's one of the reasons I think some of the bigger criminals are taking a page from this playbook. It's not just so quick, slash and burn, get in and get the data. They're learning that if they can slip in and then add some persistence, pivot on the network, span slowly but surely, that they can get in and potentially hide and be there for months. Think of the credit card skimming hacks of a few years ago with Target and Home Depot. They weren't found instantly. They were weeks of time that they would tell you, okay, if you shopped at these stores during this period, you need to go get your credit card changed. And it was weeks for some of these organizations before anybody realized that and those were criminals, not necessarily nation state players. So we can definitely see that the criminals are at the highest level are also moving into that. So depending upon, who you're being targeted by, it determines your response and it determines your diligence, etc. Now, the other thing that's talked about in there is that we have not talked about up till this point is what we call non-human threat actors. And while you will definitely be attacked by script kiddies, matter of fact, the minute you go to work, your router at home is being attacked by script kiddies now. There are constantly bot-based and scripted attacks just, trolling the net, just like a certain percentage, I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but, half or slightly more, a big chunk of all the email that runs across the internet is spam. And we spend a lot of time and money blocking that spam and filtering that spam, or when it finally does still get through all the work that techs and IT people do, we have to deal with it in our inbox and hit delete, and occasionally the false positive, we have to go take something that was in our junk and undelete it, or something gets blocked by our filters. So there's this huge hassle to deal with because a chunk of the stuff out there is spam, and a big significant chunk of the attack traffic that's going on all the time is just automated script kiddie kind of stuff. And it works because somebody will bring up a machine and not change the default password. Somebody won't configure things right. They'll make mistakes. And so every so often that automatic will find another low-hanging fruit. This course, and you're learning this industry, is all about making you not the low-hanging fruit. And so if you don't use the false passwords and you change all your basics and you do things like we're going to teach you, then those generally don't have any bearing on your life except showing up in your logs as attempting, and you block them and you move on, or they are trying something that doesn't work. You've blocked all those ports, you've fixed, you don't have that vulnerable version. So they're trying all this stuff, and it really just is a nuisance. But as you move into the middle ground, then you're going to definitely have to deal with the middle tier. Companies all size nowadays are being targeted by some of these criminal gangs, and they're obviously a notch beyond the script kiddies, but they're still using a lot of automatic tools, sending out phishing campaigns to get people to fall for those links and exploit them that way, or get a backdoor on that network computer so now they can look around and see what they can get there, or see if they can capture your credentials to go further, get into banking accounts. So there are things that you're definitely going to face. And then when it comes to that very top end, to be honest, it's going to come down to your industry. I mean, there's always the random, that somebody just at, the anomalous hacker who's still a loan shark, but it's got that kind of skill and a lot of resources that decides to pick you. But I mean, that's just so rare. And the reality is the vast majority of businesses, maybe it's the 80-20 rule or 90-10, but the vast majority of businesses aren't ever going to face a criminal. I mean, they're going to face criminal hackers, and we're all going to face script kiddies, but the vast majority of them aren't going to face nation state. I mean, China is not breaking into my great aunt's cookie company or whatever, or somebody's Etsy craft business online. That's just not likely, that's going to happen. And so the odds of, you facing that working for a small to mid-sized company are pretty slim. Now, if you work for a defense contractor, your odds just went to probably 100%. You work in certain high-tech industries and fields, and it's up there. It's in that, very high. You're in that potential 10-20% that, yes, that is what they're after. You have high-tech stuff. We want it. And that's what they're coming for. So if you work for those organizations, then your diligence is even higher. But regardless of that, weirdly enough, while we'll all have various forms of, script kiddies and middle tier hackers in our career, and we might run across a higher level hacker depending on where we go work. The other thing, though, that we all need to take into account, big and small, and potentially sometimes, funny enough, the big ones even worse, is big companies fail this worse than small companies, or have less, flexibility, is in non-human threat actors. We get so caught up, the hackers, the attackers, the crackers, the breachers, that we forget that our job is IT security. Our job is confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And I said that backwards, but confidentiality, integrity, and availability is what I really wanted to end on. Availability is the key piece that we sometimes forget. And yes, if a hacker gets in and takes down the network, then we've lost the availability, but we've probably lost confidentiality, integrity too. If a hurricane comes in and shuts down your main headquarters or your data center, or takes out a whole part of your organization, that's going to affect availability, not affecting confidentiality unless the building, is blown open and people can just loot in and steal hard drives or something. I mean, there's chances that other aspects could be affected. Integrity, for sure, if you're losing the only set of your data, which we hope is not the case, right? We'll talk about that. But that's where we have to think about, okay, we got to prepare for things. So if we have facilities in the West Coast, we best prepare for earthquakes. If we have facilities on the coastal areas, we should prepare for hurricanes, typhoons, whatever. And this depends on where we are in the world, but we have to prepare for all kinds of potential things, especially if we start working for an international. We may have facilities in a country that has a riot. We've had riots in this country. I mean, riots could be anywhere, but a civil war could break out. Other kinds of natural disasters like we're seeing down in South America, the volcano that has sadly killed so many people when it kind of just surprised everybody and decided to go off. Nature has a tendency to do that. With all the best tech we have, we are better at tracking hurricanes because of satellites and stuff, but we still don't know where it's going to turn that last day or so as it comes ashore. And so we're getting better and better at this stuff, but we can't predict it all, and we have to be prepared for it. So that leads into our last lesson that I'll wrap up here in our remaining time. And that is sort of brings all this together. Okay, we've learned about security. We've learned about these different principles that affect in how you think about planning for security. We've now learned about who we're defending against and some of the other even non-human actors that we need to factor into our planning. We know we're trying to protect that data and those resources and those assets. And we're offering, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad to our organization. And so, and we've even learned about the frameworks we can use. And so the last lesson is on organizational security, and it kind of helps you bring it all together. The idea being, okay, now we understand. We have some people we can look at, these industry bodies and national bodies. We can download some of their documents and get an idea of the template structure of what a security policy should look like. We can then do our own analysis, and we talk very much in this lesson, and you'll hear it again, about something called risk analysis, risk assessment. And this is an important part of many aspects of our security work, and it requires at least some logical thinking, if not some math skills, actually. Because of what you can come down to is every organization has to do their own risk assessment, because it's going to then help drive decisions about what level of security, which of these programs we're going to follow, how much, the trade-offs we make between security and convenience based on our needs. And so I'll take you through, a fairly simple one. Most companies, a lot of companies provide a, guest Wi-Fi access. People sitting in their waiting room or people coming to visit, right? If you have guest Wi-Fi access, then that is a definite, if you have Wi-Fi period, that is a definite attack vector for a potential, hacker or somebody trying to breach your security. So you have the deal of we both have, let's say there's two different companies, we both have Wi-Fi access for our guests. Over here we have a smiley left hand, we have a smaller company, and they don't have as much resources, tech team, etc. And so they've put up their Wi-Fi, but it's, even though it's technically it's supposed to be through their router separated, it's really running through that one system. So potentially a skilled hacker could potentially breach over and reach their network more likely than, say, this network. This other company has guest Wi-Fi, but they've literally brought in a separate line for their guest Wi-Fi, and it's not on their network at all. It's just an internet connection out for their guest. Well, they both have the possible threat, right, of hackers hacking their Wi-Fi. They both have the possible vulnerability because they have Wi-Fi. So if somebody can bring in and exploit that, but this organization can feel pretty secure because of the way they've designed it, that it's not as big of an impact on their organization. If somebody breaches the guest Wi-Fi, it's going to piss off the other guest, They might, be able to capture packets of somebody else in the waiting room, or they might be able to redirect them, or capture, but they're not going to be able to use that as a way to get into that corporation's network. This one, somebody breaches that router and then is able to get from the guest network to the corporate network, then there's a higher breach. And so they both have the same technology, but they've done it differently because of doing some logic and thinking, right? And they've done their risk analysis. And maybe this company says, well, we don't, the owner actually does all the bookkeeping at home. There's not much here besides a cash register and a few things. So there's a slim risk if somebody gets into our corporate network. But these folks over here obviously viewed that, looked at that Wi-Fi. We want to offer it, but we want to make sure it has no risk to our organization. So we separate it out. And so doing a risk assessment allows you to look at your organization and rank how important things are, and how risky they are and what the impacts will be. And it can be done in what's called a qualitative analysis, where you look at, say, okay, well, we have a website and it could be attacked, but our website only holds basic information. If it goes down, it's not really going to cost us too much. So we're going to rate that a lower risk than company B over here, who makes $10,000 an hour on web e-commerce. They have a website. It could go down because there are web hackers out there. But to them, that's a higher risk, right? But the ideal way to do it would be to really qualitatively analysis. We want to do the math. So even using that example again, this company doesn't make any direct money off its website. So how do you put a dollar to that if somebody hacked it? Well, you can estimate. I mean, the website's there for a reason. That reason is probably to find people searching on stuff, and even if they can't buy the product online, there's a phone number, I bet, right? You probably get so many leads a month off your website. You can do some analysis and figure this out, talk to the sales team. Well, we get 10 leads, and on average, we turn one of those into a sale. Well, all of a sudden, if that's the case, if 10 leads a day coming off the web and one of them turns into a sale, how much is that sale? Because now if my website goes down for a day, I have at least some idea how much it's going to cost. If that one sale is a $10,000 product, then this site makes $10,000 a day, even without e-commerce, just like this one over here does. So maybe they were wrong with their low ranking, right? They thought about it wrong. Well, and of course there's all the potential, and you have to really look at this and look at the intangible cost too. Maybe estimate those. Well, that's going to be bad for our reputation. Not to mention that if we lost that customer, it's also, if we really knew the truth, the reality is, maybe there's 100 people who come a day, 10 leads a day leads to one sale. But some of those people who came today will come back tomorrow after talking to their boss, or after thinking about it, or checking out some other competitors. They come back and they decide a few days later, and then they buy. Well, if we lose those 100 people, then we not only lose the 10 leads and the one sale, but the people are coming back tomorrow because they're out there doing their pricing today and our site's down, or we look bad because we got anonymous, Guy Fawkes mask on our site, or pro or con, whatever side of whatever issue is being argued about. So they go, well, not going to be using them, or Google pops a warning, their site's been hacked, right? So they don't come to you. And so you can factor that stuff in. So the idea is every company does their own analysis, and then they look at, that helps them then rank what they're going to address. A company that obviously makes hundreds of thousands on the web is going to be prepared to spend a lot of money to protect that and have backups and things like that. A company that doesn't make as much, and then truly they may, but you really need to do the analysis, and then the company will decide, that can help guide our security policy, which areas we need to be and where we need to put our money to fix things. And so basically, is just to wrap up here, the thing that we're trying to do ultimately, a word you're going to see a lot is what's called controls. Ultimately, when we put a security policy in place, it's made up of a series of controls. Like the password policy is a control. Without following password policy and acceptably putting your password in, you won't get into the system. That controls your access. Controls can be all kinds of different classifications. I'll leave you to read that. It's pretty straightforward. Are they preventative, corrective, reactive controls, etc.? But there are all kinds of controls: technical controls, procedural controls, and each organization is going to come up with their own list and their own guidelines and their own policies, like acceptable use and password policy, and they're going to write all this up, and we're going to document all this, and this is our security policy, and this is what we do. You have to have a certain length password. You can or can't use under acceptable use, personal stuff. You can bring your own phone, you can, or you can surf the web on lunch, but you can't other times, or you can't at all. It's only corporate. We lock it down. It's too secure. Each company will make those decisions. And as part of putting together that organizational security policy, based on all we've learned and all you'll continue to learn, there is a piece that ties into those non-human threat actors, or even to really a human threat actor if your system truly goes down. And that is all part of what's called business continuity planning, and ultimately leads into something called disaster recovery planning. And it's very important in IT and in security that we do this part of the phase where we look at things and realize, oh my gosh, if the hacker takes down our website, how do we get it back up? Do we have a backup? Is it, something we can just pull down, go get a replacement server or spin up a replacement in the cloud quickly? Do we have a backup, like maybe an offsite facility that's sitting there ready to go? We can have cold, hot, or warm offsite backups and offsite facilities, that we can bring online so that if something goes down, we can spin up those operations elsewhere. They all cost different amounts of money, and they're all different amounts of speed with which they can react. And so an organization will go through its own risk analysis, figure out what it needs to do and where it needs to put its money. And then we obviously want to put some in our layer defenses. And this is, hey, Wes. And so, Wes, are you with me? I don't have. Hi, sir. Can you hear me, sir? Wes, I was just finishing up the Security Foundations course video here, and about to switch into the system or the Network Foundations class. So if you can hear me, I'm about to kill this one. And if you were coming in for that, if you have any questions, I'll take them real quick. But then I got to start the next one at 2. If that's the one you're for, I'm going to kill this room here in a second so that it'll stop the recording and separate the security from the network. And then I'll have the room back up in a couple minutes, and you can rejoin for that one if that's the one you're going for. So anyway, if you have any questions, let me know real fast. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and kill this room, and I'll have it back up in just a few moments. All right? Thanks.